How's it going, people? In today's video I'm going to be breaking down a work in progress track of mine called Systems Thumping. This one started out as a basic loop that I created for our popular synth tutorial, where I essentially introduced a technique called fifth synths that I'm hearing quite a lot from artists like Stussy and various others. As such, this project ended up down a very Stussy influenced path, utilising loads of similar sounds and techniques that you might expect to hear in his tracks. Here is a preview of what we're going to be looking at today. As always, the first thing we have is these kind of vocals. So the first one we've got is this a cappella.
Release the pause button, the bassline's pumping, system thumping, so here's a little something.
I basically found this vocal just a kind of hip hop a cappella and throwing it in because the lyrics kind of fit with that house style.
Bassline's pumping, system thumping, so here's a little something.
Basically, when I'm listening to these a cappellas, I'm listening out for certain lyrics, stuff to do with bass lines and house music, and all those kind of lyrics often tend to work really well. I know someone will ask about a cappellas, so I'll mention it now. I am actually planning a separate video going into depth on basically everything you need to know about vocals. We'll dive into not only the places, but the different kind of vocal types as well in that tutorial. So we've got one from the house crew called Dance to the House.
Release the pause button, the bassline's building instructions, the clubs that be jumping. Everybody works in the underground. Up on a stronger level, mixing beats and poetry with bass and the underground. Dance to the house.
So you've got loads of really cool a cappellas, and they kind of make me think of a lot of the stuff that Stussy kind of uses.
Release the pause button, the bassline's pumping, system thumping, so here's a little something.
So that's the a cappella. Then we move into ad-lib territory. I know a lot of people also ask about like where to find ad-libs, and I'm going to be revealing a really cool source for those in that upcoming video, so if we stay tuned and if you want to subscribe so you don't miss it, I would recommend that. I've got these ad-libs. What I've done here is I've searched terms like house
music. For those of you who just get
and house music was born.
This is the sound of house music.
and that's basically acting as like the kind of transition vocal.
This is the sound of house music.
Then we've got this ad-lib, which is essentially just similar phrase but playing more constantly, just to kind of build up tension.
I'm in the house. I'm in the house. I'm in the house. I'm in the house.
And the final one I have is these textures. You can either take the note and duplicate it, or you can just load an arpeggiator so that you can basically just hold the note.
This is the sound of house music.
So those are basically the vocals. Up next we have the drums, starting off with this kick. Pretty standard 4/4, and the actual sample I've used this time round is one of the kind of sample market ones. I think generally speaking, if you're after that kind of minimal style, the whole kind of sample market collection is a good starting point. Often you find with a lot of these samples, they're already quite processed, so you don't really need to do much, but I quite like adding the drum bus effect to my kicks just to add a little bit extra punch. Claps and snares, we'll just play them as a group. For the clap, I've just used another one shot from that pack. Just a kind of nice snappy 909 with a bit of reverb. The snare uses a sample from a breakbeat. If you're ever struggling to find nice snares, then I would recommend looking in like breakbeats and chopping up slices from them. In terms of the pattern, we've got the kind of standard 2 and the 4 as the clap, and then we've got the snare doing these kind of snare groovers. I think the main thing to consider with them is to alter the velocity and just play around with the actual placement. So we've got them, and then the final thing we've got is just a snare roll. So starts with 16ths, just gradually rising. And then there's a bit of a different fill. So it basically builds up that tension and then releases that tension for the final 4 bars. Got these hats. This open hat, bit of reverb. Sometimes I'm adding saturation as well to just kind of add a bit more grit to the sounds. Got this 808 closed. Playing this nice kind of shaker pattern which bounces off the open. And then building on that complexity, we've got this shuffle, which is a lot lower in volume, but it's kind of adding to the complexity of the hat groove. And then finally, we've got this kind of electro shaker, which is just playing that final 16th. For these loops, I've used a combination of different sound sources, and the kind of main takeaway from this group is the way I've processed them. Up first, we've got this. An approach you should try and consider when it comes to loops is essentially trying to make them more your own, as opposed to just dropping them in and leaving them as they are. This loop here was from Stussy back originally, so to take it further, I've basically just added reverb, phasing, and then sidechained it. We've got this one. So this one was quite electro-inspired, and I've kind of done a similar process. So we've got that. We've got this kind of texture breakbeat further on, which is changed massively. It's been flanged almost 100%. The final one is this break. So that is essentially going to conclude the drums. Up next we have these kind of bass groups, starting off with the main bass. So the first place I normally go is the sound. I've started using this preset quite a lot called HS Flap, and basically what I do is I bring the emphasis up and basically play around with other parameters like the cutoff. Then what I've done is I've done pretty simple stuff with regards to EQing, compression, and because the bass is quite a high bass, I've been able to take advantage of that by adding stuff like reverbs and delays. So we've essentially got that sound and then the pattern. The next part we have is this sub. So it's playing a very simple pattern, mostly the root, with a bit of change. A lot of the time with these kind of sub patterns, what I'm essentially doing is I'm either taking the main pattern and simplifying it, or I'm just writing a simple pattern that goes alongside it. The processing is normally very simple for these. If I had to summarize, these 3 effects are pretty much on every subchain with some variants. So an interesting thing about this sound is it's actually a main bass, so it would have originally sounded like this. But because I've filtered it, it's keeping only the sub. The next layer we have is these kind of textures. If you want an in-depth breakdown of kind of bass textures, then I do recommend our bass fundamentals tutorial. Essentially the textures are those kind of bass sounds that sit a bit further up in the frequency spectrum than that kind of main bass. I've essentially got this sound. Essentially I've taken this sound. It's from this native instrument called FM8. Basically what I've done is I've used the filter freak, which is basically adding this kind of modulation and movement to the sound, which just gives it a bit more life. So I've basically just kind of added this extra bass layer for variation and just to add a bit of depth to the overall bass grip. So I've basically got that texture, and the final thing is these fifth basses that I was talking about in the fifth bass tutorial. One of the best things about these fifth patches is you don't need to overcomplicate the MIDI patterns. So I've basically just got these kind of patterns just playing off each other. As you'll see if I just do a quick comparison. They start at the same place and the patterns are kind of working off each other. I know for a fact Stussy does this with his melodies, where they're basically just playing different patterns, but when you introduce them together it works really nicely as these kind of counter melodies. For the synths we have similar kind of setup with the leads, the chords and the pad layers. I have reason to believe that Stussy is using more uncommon plugins. So these next two lead layers, I've used one of those plugins I suspect he might use, called Synth Master. We've got this synth lead layer. And just to add a bit of interest to that, we've also got the kind of filter moving slightly, very slowly. We've got this lead. Use this preset, which is meant to be like a brass 80s sound, which I can kind of hear. With the pattern, sometimes you'll just be in the moment and you'll just be randomly jamming things and you won't even be aware of it at the time. But all those places that you've built up inspiration from musically over the years, sometimes you can just like start integrating them in. So this lead vaguely resembles a track by Yazoo called Don't Go. Next we've got this kind of plucky sound. So this is kind of the melody that I'd use in the breaks. Basically when I want something a bit different, I'll introduce an additional kind of synth layer. And the final sound is just this kind of fill. So it's quite a nice sound, and the main thing about this effects chain is I've got the LFO amount quite high, and then I've got the rate higher than 1, which makes it move a lot faster. Next up in the synths group is these chords. These first chords are essentially the fifth chords I showed in that previous tutorial, but I'll try and avoid repeating myself and I'll kind of just expand on that a bit. We've got two different patterns here, so I think I would have started with this. I think a kind of key takeaway when it comes to fifth patterns is you can keep it very simple, and I think using these kind of fifth sounds is actually quite beneficial in helping you to come up with patterns because the sound has a bit more depth, so it's almost easier to come up with things melodically. For that second pattern, I've kind of switched it up. I think I might have been playing around with the invert, which basically flips the melody upside down. So we've got that, and then Just to add depth to that sound, we've just layered it with an organ. Finally, we've just got these pads. I've got this nice kind of triad, and then we're adding 7ths and 9ths just to add a bit of depth to the chord. We're layering that with the same patch. So I spoke about how you can use these 5th synths as different sounds. We've obviously used it for the bass, we've used it for the chords, and you can also use it for pads. So that's essentially just what this one is. We've layered that with some strings. And then we've got this sequence sound. So that is basically the synths. Then finally, we'll just kind of quickly touch on the SFX. We've got these crashes, basically just playing in pretty frequent places. And then I'm using those same ones as fills. We've also got a reverse. We've got this kind of downlifter. We've got the riser, which does the opposite. You've got this kind of riser. Then you've got these kind of vocal builds. I hear this a lot actually in Stussy's tracks. Then the final one is this, which is basically like a rhythmic scratch. So that is just quickly the SFX, and that is going to conclude the full project. So that is going to conclude this breakdown of my track Systems Thumping. As I said before, this one ended up down a very Stussy-inspired route, so I hope it gave you a bit of inspiration on kind of different sounds and techniques you might use, if that's kind of the vibe you're after. If you've got any value from this, then I'll ask that you head below and hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment if you wish to share your thoughts. If you wish to carry on watching, then I'll leave some recommendations on the screen shortly that you might enjoy, and I'll see you in the next one.